Frank Lucas heard it the way most dangerous truths arrive in Harlem, not as a headline, not as a confession, but as a whisper that didn't want to be repeated twice. Bumpy kept 50 million for you. Those words landed in Frank's chest like a sudden weight, not because he believed every rumor that floated through the neighborhood after a king died, but because the messenger wasn't a loudmouth. The man who said it was careful, quiet, the kind of person who didn't speak unless he had to. It was the morning after the funeral. The city still felt like it was holding its breath. Bumpy Johnson was gone. The streets didn't celebrate it. They didn't even fully accept it. Harlem just moved slower, like the neighborhood was waiting for someone to step out of the shadows and declare what came next. Frank didn't go home. He didn't go to a bar. He didn't go to church. He went to a place he had been 100 times, and yet suddenly felt like he was trespassing inside the spaces Bumpy used to own without ever looking like he owned anything. Bumpy had lived like a man who understood a simple rule: if you look rich, somebody will try to prove you're not. Frank had watched him for years, watched him wear suits that weren't loud, drive cars that weren't flashy, move with the calm of someone who'd already won the war but refused to celebrate in public. And now, Bumpy was dead. Officially, it was a heart attack at a Harlem restaurant late at night. That part was real. That part was clean. But nothing about power ever ends clean. Frank sat alone in a quiet room, and the rumor kept circling back like a bird that refused to land. 50 million. In 1968, that number didn't sound like wealth. It sounded like a different kind of physics. It sounded impossible, too big to hide, too big to move, too big to survive. And yet, Frank knew something most people didn't. Bumpy had enemies, but Bumpy's greatest enemy wasn't a gangster. It was attention. Bumpy hated attention. Bumpy treated attention like poison. So if Bumpy truly had money like that, he wouldn't keep it in a bank. He wouldn't keep it with family. He wouldn't keep it in a safe that a warrant could crack open. He would keep it where men with badges wouldn't even think to look, or where they'd look, but the wrong way. Frank replayed every memory he had of Bumpy's habits, every pattern, every place he returned to, every business that looked boring on paper, but meant something deeper in the neighborhood. And then Frank remembered something else. Bumpy didn't just run numbers and enforce the rules. He played the long game. He bought legitimacy like a shield, places that served the community, places that didn't raise questions, places where grief came and went every day. That's when the rumor stopped sounding like nonsense and started sounding like strategy. Frank stood up, put on his coat, and left without telling anyone where he was, going, because if the rumor was true, he couldn't afford witnesses. And if the rumor was false, he couldn't afford to look desperate. He moved through Harlem like a man walking a tightrope. One wrong step and the whole neighborhood would feel it. By the time night fell, Frank wasn't thinking about money anymore. He was thinking about a test. Because if Bumpy really left him anything, it wouldn't be a gift. It would be a message. And Frank had a feeling that message was hidden inside a place where nobody expected secrets to breathe. Harlem after midnight had two faces. One face was loud, music leaking out of windows, laughter on corners, arguments that ended in handshakes. That face distracted you. That face made you believe everything was normal. The other face was silent. That face watched you. Frank preferred the silent one. Silence didn't lie. He drove slow, with the lights low, like he was trying not to disturb the neighborhood. Not because he feared the cops the most, but because he feared the wrong people noticing his curiosity. Curiosity was a scent in Harlem. If you carried it, predators could smell it. He passed familiar blocks and didn't stop. He passed familiar men and didn't nod. Tonight wasn't about respect. Tonight was about survival. The rumor had named a number, but numbers don't matter without a location, and locations don't matter unless they're protected. Frank kept circling the same thought. Bumpy would hide it, where nobody would dare turn over every stone. Not a drug house, not a stash spot, not an apartment. Those were expected. Those were the first places any serious investigator would tear apart. No, Bumpy's genius wasn't that he hid things deep. It was that he hid things in places so normal they became invisible. And there was one kind of business that practically lived on invisibility. A place everyone entered, everyone respected, and no one truly explored. A place built around the dead. Frank pulled over, a block away, parked where shadows broke up the lines of his car, and sat still for a moment, listening. He could hear a siren far off, could hear a late-night bus breathing at a stop, could hear the city's pulse. Then he got out and walked. No entourage, no backup, no second car. In this world, bringing people meant giving them a reason to betray you later. The door he approached didn't look like a vault. It looked like a regular door. That was the point. If it looked like a vault, it would attract the kind of attention that got you killed. Frank slid the key in and turned it carefully. Inside, the air changed. Everything smelled like polish, flowers, and something colder underneath, something that didn't belong to the living. He moved through rooms that felt staged for grief. Chairs placed neatly, curtains drawn, hushed corners where families would whisper and stare at the floor. Frank's footsteps sounded too loud. He didn't open every drawer. He didn't flip over every table. That wasn't how you beat a man like Bumpy. You didn't search harder. You searched smarter. He walked deeper, toward the back, past the formal spaces and into the working spaces, the rooms where grief became process. Metal, tools, clean surfaces. The kind of order that felt almost religious. And then he saw it. Not money, not a safe, not a hidden panel. A door that led into cold. A storage area, industrial, practical, the kind of place no one wanted to spend time in. The kind of place your mind avoided even imagining. Frank stopped in front of it. If this was nothing, the whole rumor was just Harlem talking. But if this was something... He opened the door. Cold air hit his face like a slap. Inside, everything was quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of a sleeping city. The quiet of a place where time didn't move. There were forms inside. Shapes covered in white. Frank's heart kicked once, hard, like it recognized danger before his mind did. Because the human brain has rules. Even gangsters have rules. And one of them is simple. You don't disturb what's under a sheet in a cold room unless you're ready for what it means. Frank stepped closer anyway. He reached out, and his fingers touched fabric that felt stiff with cold. He paused. Then he lifted it. And what he saw didn't look like a fortune at first. It looked like a body that wasn't a body. A shape wrapped and sealed. Hard edges where soft curves should be. Plastic glinting under the weak light. Frank pulled the sheet back another inch, and his breath caught. Because it wasn't flesh. It was stacks. Stacks of bills packed tight, wrapped like evidence, sealed like contraband, arranged with the same care a mortician would use on a corpse. Frank didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He stared at it like it was a living thing. Because if this was real, if this was even a fraction of what the rumor claimed, then Bumpy hadn't just hidden money. He'd hidden power in a form that dared anyone to touch it. Frank lowered the sheet again, slowly. Then he turned. And in that cold room, he finally understood the second part of the rumor. If the FBI had been looking for it, they weren't just hunting cash. They were hunting the proof that Bumpy had been winning the whole time, and now Frank had to decide whether finding it would make him the next king, or the next dead man. Frank didn't take it all. That's what amateurs did. Amateurs got greedy. Greedy men got loud. Loud men got buried. Frank took a small amount, small enough to hide, small enough to move without changing his life overnight. He didn't treat the money like lottery winnings. He treated it like radioactive material, because that's what it was. He walked out of the cold room with his face calm, like nothing had happened. The trick wasn't to act innocent. The trick was to act normal. Innocence drew questions. Normal gave people nothing. He locked the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening for footsteps that weren't his. Nothing. Still, he didn't relax. Not fully. He drove away the long way, taking turns that didn't make sense, checking mirrors, watching for headlights that stayed too close. Harlem had more eyes than a courthouse. Somebody always saw something. But Frank's fear wasn't just the cops. Bumpy's death created a vacuum. Vacuums attract predators. Every crew that had ever swallowed pride in Bumpy's presence would now test the air, see if the rules still held, and rumors moved faster than cars. Within days, Frank noticed it. Little things. A man lingering too long near a corner he used to pass without thought. A car parked in the same spot 2 evenings in a row. A stranger's eyes holding his face half a second longer than polite. It wasn't proof, but Frank didn't need proof. Proof was for courts. Instinct was for survival. He tightened up, spoke less, moved differently, changed routines, and still he could feel the weight of it, the knowledge that he had touched something that could reshape Harlem. The money wasn't just a stash, it was a seed. If he used it right, he could build the kind of organization Bumpy only hinted at. Something cleaner on the outside, something sharper underneath. But to do that, he needed time. And time was the one thing the FBI could steal without firing a bullet. Because while Frank was learning how to pull money from the cold room without leaving ripples, somebody else was learning how to read those ripples. Federal investigators had spent years circling Bumpy. Some of them resented him. Some of them admired him. But all of them understood one thing. Men like Bumpy didn't die broke. Bumpy's death didn't end their interest. It intensified it. And when informants started whispering about a hidden fortune, it became a new kind of hunt. Not because the Bureau needed the cash, but because the cash would prove the story they'd been chasing was real. The problem with a fortune rumor is that it doesn't just attract cops. It attracts everybody. Rivals started sniffing around too. Old enemies, new opportunists, men who believed Bumpy's treasure was up for grabs simply because Bumpy wasn't there to stop them. Frank caught wind of a meeting, 2 crews talking, speculating, trying to piece together Bumpy's habits like archaeologists with bad intentions. Frank realized something that night. The money's hiding spot was brilliant. But the hiding spot didn't matter if the idea of the money became common knowledge, because once people believed the fortune existed, they'd tear Harlem apart searching for it. And if they tore Harlem apart, somebody would eventually tear open the right door. That was when Frank made a second decision. He wasn't going to just take from the stash, he was going to protect it. Not like a caretaker, like a man protecting a throne he hadn't officially sat on yet. He started planting his own. Misdirection. Quiet suggestions in the right ears. A few false trails. A few rumors pointing toward buildings Bumpy once owned. Places that would waste time and energy if searched. Let them dig in basements. Let them rip up floors. Let them hunt for safes. The best hiding place wasn't the cold room. The best hiding place was the human tendency to look in the wrong direction. And it worked. At least for a while. But one night, Frank drove past the street again and saw something that turned his blood cold. A car he didn't recognize. Parked close, engine off, lights out, but inside, a faint orange glow, like a cigarette being raised and lowered in the dark. Someone was waiting. Not a random thief, not a drunk, a watcher. Frank kept driving. Didn't slow down, didn't look again, but in his chest he felt the truth click into place. The hunt had started, and it wasn't going to stop until somebody either found the money or found him. The FBI didn't crash into Harlem like a movie. They came like pressure, warrants, interviews, quiet surveillance, a man at the end of a block too many mornings in a row, a face in a bar that didn't drink, a question asked twice, casually, to see if your answer changed. They didn't need to say they were hunting a fortune. Harlem could tell. Because when federal attention lingers, the streets feel it. Conversations tighten. Hustlers change corners. Everybody starts watching everybody else, and trust becomes expensive. Frank understood the psychology of the Bureau. They didn't want drama. They wanted paperwork and proof. They wanted to seize, document, and erase the myth. But Bumpy wasn't just a case file. Bumpy was a legend. And legends create obsession. Some investigators chased the rumor for months, then moved on when it didn't pay. Others, especially the ones who'd been embarrassed by Bumpy in life, couldn't let it go. They searched properties. They pulled records. They pressured men who used to smile around Bumpy and suddenly couldn't remember anything. And every time they came up empty, the rumor grew teeth, because empty searches don't end stories. They strengthen them. Frank watched all of it from the inside, forced to play two games at once, building his own operation while keeping his hands clean enough not to draw heat that could lead someone back to the cold room. The most dangerous moment wasn't a raid. It was pattern recognition, because the FBI didn't need a confession. They needed a pattern, a man who visits the same place too often, at the same time, for no visible reason. So Frank changed the rhythm. Sometimes he didn't go for weeks. Sometimes he went and didn't take anything. Sometimes he drove by and kept going. He treated the fortune like a living animal that could sense fear, but even with all that caution, the pressure climbed. Somewhere in the Bureau's world, a theory started to form. That Bumpy's fortune wasn't hidden in a classic stash spot. That it was hidden in plain sight. The exact kind of phrase investigators hated, because it meant their training could be used against them. And that's when they started searching businesses that looked too normal. Places with community value. Places with steady foot traffic. Places you couldn't simply bulldoze without making headlines. Places like funeral homes. Frank heard about the first time they came through, not from an agent, but from the neighborhood's grapevine. They were in there for hours. Dogs, tools, everything. Frank didn't panic. He went cold. Because the problem with a place built around death is that people assume certain areas are off limits. Even investigators have boundaries. They'll open drawers, check walls, examine basements. But many men, badge or no badge, hesitate when it comes to disturbing what appears to be a body. Frank knew that was the entire point of the stash. If this legend was true at all, if Bumpy truly hid something massive, then the genius wasn't a lock or a secret tunnel. The genius was the social rule nobody wanted to break. Don't touch the dead. Don't question the dead. Don't look too closely at the dead. That rule protected the stash better than steel. But rules can break under obsession, and if an agent got obsessed enough, he'd do what polite society wouldn't. Frank understood that the longer the rumor lived, the more likely obsession would grow. So he accelerated his plan. Not reckless, strategic. He moved money into layers, small investments, quiet partnerships, pieces that looked legitimate, pieces that wouldn't scream Harlem Gangster to a bank clerk or a clerk in a courthouse. He didn't need the whole fortune in his hands. He needed the fortune to become invisible in a different way, because frozen money was safe, until somebody decided to look under the sheet. But money turned into legitimate assets. That could survive raids, trials, even prison. Frank had learned the real lesson of Harlem. It wasn't about hiding. It was about transforming what you had into something no one recognized as yours. But even that lesson couldn't protect him from one thing: the Watchers. Because while the FBI searched wrong doors, other men watched the right man. And one night, Frank noticed the same car again, same spot, same darkness, same faint glow. Only this time. There were two silhouettes inside, and one of them lifted something that wasn't a cigarette. It was a camera. Years later, people would say Frank Lucas got greedy. They'd say he got sloppy. They'd say he couldn't resist being seen. And that's the cruel irony of power. You can survive bullets, betrayals, and federal pressure, and still be undone by vanity. The historical record around Frank Lucas gets messy in places, and even his relationship to Bumpy is argued over. But what's widely repeated in serious retellings is that Frank's rise eventually drew heat, and his public flash at a major boxing match became part of the legend of how attention found him. Frank knew attention was poison. He knew it the way a man knows fire burns, because he'd watched it burn others down. And yet, the neighborhood changes you. Success changes you. The world starts treating you like you're untouchable, and a part of you begins to believe it. For a while, Frank lived inside the discipline Bumpy taught. Stay calm, stay quiet, stay invisible. Then he cracked. The crack wasn't a gunshot. It was a moment, a decision, a piece of clothing that said, "Look at me." And once you say, "Look at me," the world does. The pressure hit hard after that. Investigators that once circled wide started circling close. Old enemies sharpened their smiles. Friends started acting nervous. Everyone around Frank began calculating how to survive if he fell. That's when Frank understood something else. The money, the stash, the legend, none of it mattered if he ended up buried. Like a cautionary tale. When the walls finally closed in, Frank did what cornered men do. He negotiated. He offered information. Because in America, information is sometimes the only currency stronger than cash. And that's where the legend of the 50 million becomes truly dangerous. Not because it's romantic, because if there really was a stash, if there really was a secret Bumpy left behind, then Frank was the only living man who could confirm it. And confirmation would change everything. It would turn a rumor into a target. It would turn a cold room into a war zone. It would turn Harlem into a chessboard with too many hands reaching for the same piece. So when Frank sat across from men with badges and paperwork, the tension wasn't just, can they prove the drugs? It was, will he talk about the secret that kept the streets buzzing for years? Frank stared at them, calm, like he was still in control, even if he wasn't. Then he said something that made the room shift, not a confession, not yet, a test. "How long you been looking for what Bumpy hid?" Frank asked. The agents didn't answer at first. They didn't want to admit obsession. Frank smiled slightly, the way a man smiles when he knows he has a card nobody else has. "You searched the right places," he said. "You just searched the wrong way." That line, right there, was the knife. Because investigators hate riddles. They want facts. They want addresses. They want boxes of evidence to stack in front of a jury. But Frank didn't give them that. Not immediately. Instead, he let them sit inside the discomfort of the idea that they'd been close, maybe close for years, without realizing it. And in that discomfort, the hunger grew. Frank watched it grow. Then he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said the words that would haunt anyone who'd spent years chasing a ghost. "If I tell you where it is, you're not going to believe what you're standing next to." The room went silent. One of the agents swallowed. Another shifted in his chair. Frank held their eyes like he was holding a leash. And for a moment, it felt like Bumpy Johnson wasn't dead at all. It felt like Bumpy was still teaching from the grave, using Frank as the final lesson. Then Frank added the detail that changed everything. Not everything he left was meant to be found. And that was the first time the agents looked at each other like men realizing they were late to a race they didn't even know had started. The legend always said 50 million. But legends do that. They round numbers into symbols. Even in the most exaggerated underworld stories, the details that matter aren't the exact amount. They're the implication. If Bumpy could hide that kind of wealth, then the entire system that chased him had been operating with blind spots. And blind spots get people fired. They also get people killed. The night after Frank's meeting with the feds, the city felt different. Like the rumor had been injected back into the bloodstream of Harlem, stronger than ever. Because now it wasn't just street talk. Now federal men were moving like men who finally had a direction. Cars appeared in places they hadn't been before. Quiet faces stood under streetlights and pretended they were waiting for buses that never came. The pressure didn't come as a raid yet. It came as inevitability. Frank understood something terrifying. Even if he never spoke another word, the fact that he had hinted was enough. Once investigators believe there is a right way to search, they will keep searching until the city cracks. Frank drove late, taking routes he hadn't used in years, thinking through every contingency. If the Bureau went back to the cold room, what would they do differently? Would they finally break the rule and look under every sheet? Would they bring men who didn't hesitate? Frank also thought about rivals. Men who'd been patient were no longer patient. If the feds were closing in, the streets would race them, and street races don't have rules. That's when Frank remembered a detail that didn't fit. The rumor in Harlem always said 50 million, but the underworld was built on accounting. Even Bumpy. Bumpy wouldn't leave a number like that sloppy. Unless the sloppiness was intentional. Unless the 50 million was a story designed to make everyone search in one direction, while something smaller, something sharper, stayed hidden elsewhere. Frank turned his car around and drove toward the place again, not to take money, not to check the stash, to check for a message, because Bumpy was the kind of man who understood that money is temporary, but leverage lasts. Frank entered quietly, moved through the halls and reached the cold door. He didn't open everything. He didn't touch every bundle. He went straight to one corner where the airflow felt different, where the frost didn't settle the same way. He lifted a sheet just enough to see behind it. And there, taped to the metal frame with the patience of a man who planned for death, was a small envelope. Yellowed, unmarked, sealed. Frank's pulse jumped. He peeled it off slowly, like it might trigger an alarm just from being disturbed. Inside was not a note with directions, not a map, not an address. It was a single line, written in tight handwriting, the kind of handwriting that looked like it never wasted ink. "The last 2 million isn't for you. It's for whoever survives what's coming." Frank stared at the words until they blurred. Because in that sentence, Bumpy wasn't talking about money. He was talking about war. And in that moment, standing in the cold, with the city above him and federal pressure tightening, Frank realized the story wasn't ending. It was starting. He folded the paper, put it back, and walked out like a man leaving a church after hearing a sermon he didn't want. Outside, the street looked normal. Too normal. Then he saw it. Across the block, parked at the curb, engine idling. The same car. But this time, the door opened. A man stepped out. Not FBI, not a cop, a rival. And he smiled at Frank like he already knew the secret. Frank didn't move. The man raised his hand, slow, revealing the edge of that same yellow envelope in his fingers, and he said one sentence that made Frank's stomach drop. "Tell me where Bumpy hid the rest, or I start digging up the dead."